Let's get started. We also have a full afternoon. Again, I would like to encourage you. It's what I always do with my students, my graduate students. It's important to remember not to approach this Tillichian material in a non-Tillichian way, because if you approach it in a non-existentialist way, then you won't get it at all, because it's essentially an existentialist philosophy. That is to say, you have to ask, how does this apply to me? And how does it apply to my struggle with being, to connect with being and resist the power of non-being, some of the Freudian traditions, some of the great thinkers in the Freudian tradition talk about is the death drive. I mean, they understand something that Tillich's pointing to. The Freudians in some ways better than Jungians, at least a lot of the time in our more superficial readings of Jung. The Freudian, the classical Freudians and the Lacanian Freudians have a sense that there's something trying to kill you. In you, there's something inside that's trying to push you over the edge of the abyss. And so when you read this stuff, or you listen to this stuff, or you study this stuff, you need to come at it existentially, or it'll just be a kind of a mental masturbation and metaphysical moonshine. It's so what? But if you engage with this, if you got the courage to engage with it on the existential level, it will open your eyes to a lot of things. And you want to be asking. I'm gonna take a little time a little bit later, basically when we get into the last part this afternoon. I want you to be ready to dialogue some with a dialogue partner about where is the non-being coming at you. You don't have to tell them everything about it, but if we're real, you can have a sense about where you think it's coming at you. And what kind of anxiety seems most present consciously that we were talking about a while ago? Maybe not. That'd be great. There's none, say it. But what kind of courage do you think you've got some of, or what kind of courage do you think you need more of? Some people, it's very clear they need one kind of courage. They've got the other kind. Other people have got both, and so they're not having a courage problem. That's wonderful. Or you may be having a problem with courage on both of them. It may be hard to be yourself, it may be hard to relate. In which case, we got to find a way to plug you into the juice, get you some energy. So anyway, be thinking about that, and I won't ask you to say anything that will get you into any kind of toxic shame. But if there's something that you're aware of, if you think about this, that you can appropriately share. We try to be a learning community here at the Institute. Okay, now what we're going to do before the break is I'm going to focus on elements in the struggle for transformation, and as some of you requested, the obstacles for transformation. What are the obstacles in both Tillich and Jung? And the first thing I want to do is just give you my little shorthand summary of what are the elements of transformative process. And this would be true for individuals as well as organizations, cities, cultures, planet Earth. So these are the elements of transformative process. And I say that there are really fundamentally four of these. Of course, you know me, I always think in fours. That's part of my debt to Jung, the quaternio. But the first thing you've got to have, and put all this under the rubrics of increasing awareness, which is what both a great philosophical mind and a great psychoanalytic mind, regardless of the school of thought, is trying to increase our awareness in the service of life. So the first element, I believe, is what I call diagnosis or diagnostics. Some call it assessment. What is the situation here? And it takes enormous effort, enormous drawing on what I call your archetype of the magician in your psyche. You may be very good, and most people that are interested in Jung usually have a lot of magician in them, But even if you've got a lot of this magician, you're really an analytical mind, and you really pride yourself on your awareness, don't underestimate how much further you have to go. Because there is a kind of a Gnostic reality, a gnosis, a kind of deep knowing that is beyond the shallow understanding of any of the theories or anything. And you're wired for that. You have the capacity to have a deep knowing that opens, that gets you through the veil of enchantment and lets you see more clearly. Now, it's not pleasant to see more clearly. That's why we retreat into denial. In other words, it takes courage to be able to face what's happening. Face the dragon, I say in this manuscript I'm preparing. But this is a key element. It's a key element. And so you got to have a sense of what is wrong here. And that's why both from a psychoanalytic point of view or a philosophical point of view, you use Tillich diagnostically to locate where the front is in your struggle for selfhood and for fulfillment. Because if you don't know where the actual front is, you can't send any resources there. So the first thing is to crank up the magician. And, I've found that this is true, even if you're really, really dysfunctional. The place you can move first, it's got a lot to do with strategy and healing. If you're really, really feel like you're just about to drown in all of it, you're not going to be able to figure out where you want to go. Vision, I'll call it. You won't be able to do that. You're up to your rear end in alligators, and you can't keep your mind on draining the swamp. So don't try. Don't try to get the integrated vision at that point. You need courage to do all this, but you may not be in touch with any part of this warrior side of yourself yet. You may be terrified and fear. You're not going to have a real good warrior right now. We want it online as soon as we can, but you're probably not going to have it. You need a lot of energy. So those are the elements. Diagnosis, vision for where you need to go, courage to take action to get there, and the energy to fuel the courage. When you really understand this, then you'll know why it's so hard to change. You understand these four things, you will understand why it's so hard to change. Each one of these plays a part. If you're really going to be moving toward your optimum transformation, you cannot neglect any of these four elements. Let me stay with the first one a minute. You've got to locate where you are, what's happening. And this is, I have learned through a lot of struggle with folks, that even if you're really struggling, the best place to move is into increasing the awareness of where am I, mapping. This is why I put so much energy in my work, in my lectures here at the Institute, about psychopathology, understanding the personal and archetypal dimensions of psychopathology. There are people that think, if you study psychopathology or you put so much emphasis on assessment, you're really not a humanist, or you're really crippling people or whatever. I understand where they're coming from, but that's very wrong-headed. because a healer needs to know what's wrong. You don't treat all illnesses the same way. You need to know what's wrong. And so it's important to raise this awareness, get the awareness cranking. And there are lots of ways to do this. And this is one of the reasons we come to things like this, to hone our awareness. We know no matter how smart we are or how much we've studied, there's always something more to understand that might be liberating for us. So the first element is just diagnosis. What is going on? And in my teaching, I've tried to show in my lectures that are available here through the Institute that there's a shape of psychopathology. It is not a meaningless morass. It's patterned. And if you put some energy into studying it, you can figure out specifically what's going wrong with you and why. In other words, what is the weak link in my inner chains? There is a particular kind of place where your self begins to fragment. And it's not the same for everybody. But it's not completely protean. It's not completely all over the place. In my view, if you work in a tradition that's truly Jungian and hasn't thrown out Jung's fundamentals to chase after some other theoretical perspective, that there really is a shape of how we get in trouble, and you can see that Tillich thought that too. It's not all over the place. It's when we're about to lose. It's only when we're about to lose our fingernail grasp on our human reality that it looks like it's all the same. But it's not all the same. And so if we're going to help ourselves, or if we're going to help other people, we have to help them have maps, psychic geographical maps. We have to map the way things go wrong. Like we were saying this morning, sometimes things are going wrong because you're putting too much emphasis on destiny. Sometimes things go wrong because you think you're more free than you are. Translate that grandiosity. And so on. All right, element 2. A vision. It's not enough to know what's wrong with you, because if you simply, this is the good part about why people are afraid of diagnosis. Because too often psychological professionals don't really have a very sophisticated view of the possible human, as Gene Houston puts it. In fact, I would suggest to you that if you study the mental health delivery system in current psychiatry, they're getting dumber and dumber. It's embarrassing. To me, as a mental health professional, the lack of sophistication of contemporary psychiatry philosophically, or even psychologically, there's an incredible, well, let's put it in Tillich's terms. Contemporary psychiatry is making the mistake of totally privileging the destiny pole. Everything is simply your biochemistry, and it's all hereditary. Not anything you can really do about it. In fact, there's so little that you can do about it, I don't even have to talk to you more than 5 minutes when you come in with your problem. I just give you a pill. That's kind of a demonic sacrament. It's not that we don't need psychotropic drugs. We do. But if you have a view of the human, it's so inadequate that that's your view of cure. Somebody needs to help you with your grandiosity. Somebody needs to help you realize that when you're dealing with human beings, it's complicated. It's not that simple. Do you follow what I'm saying there? And so we need to realize that a lot of psychologies have a very inadequate view of the possible human. I would say almost all of them. And it's one of the things, even Jungians can learn something from some of these philosophers of human. That is, the possible human. I mean, there's a lot to be learned about that, even by folks that have learned from Jung. Okay, the third element. So you got to have a vision on where you want to go. If you're too preoccupied with what's wrong with you, you won't put enough energy into where you want to go. What's possible for you? When I look at someone, I'm interested in their psychopathology. I mean, that's, face it, I got a lot of magician in me. If it moves, I'm going to diagnose it. But it's not enough to be a magician. You got to be a healer. There's got to be an integrated shamanic kind of thing going on. So when I'm looking at somebody, I'm asking myself, where could this person go? What are their strengths? Where are they, using Tillich, where are they plugged into the power of being? If this person could plug into the power of being, what might be possible? Because they look a lot different if you ask that question than if you're just focusing on the fact that they're X category. You follow that? So when you're looking at the potential optimum functioning of this person through a large view of the human, you can know what's wrong with them and it won't get you that in despair about them. You follow me? You don't need a therapist that's in despair about you. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
You know what the severe reality of this is? There are a lot of therapists that are in despair about themselves. And if they're in despair about themselves, what chance do you think they're going to have to see your potential? Yeah.
Say, I think it's very Jungian to say, oh, I want to say that's a tragedy. I mean, it's actually in
Yeah, all mental health practitioners, we all struggle with this because, and this is where we'll get to this afternoon in terms of spiritual practice. It doesn't matter how good your theory is. In my view, in Jung's view, in Tillich's view, and in my view, a good psychological theory will teach you a lot about the plumbing. It won't hook you up to the water. In other words, psychological theories do not connect you to the power of being. They can do a lot of wonderful mapping. Some of us love these maps. Some of us create maps. But that's not energy. We'll come to that later. Okay. Courage to take a stand for your best self. The courage to be, very simply, Tillich makes it very clear in that courage to be, you got to really look carefully to get those sentences. There's not a wasted sentence in there. But what is courage? Well, Tillich assumes that there are all these things that are antagonistic to your really taking a stand in defense and advocacy for your best self. There are all these things, outer things, we're going to talk about them in a minute, outer things and inner things, which are trying to create chaos in your personality system, not serving your integration and your blossoming into the golden flower that Jung talked about. And why do you have, what is the role of courage? If you do not have courage, it's probably going to be hard for you to face the truth about yourself first. It's going to scare you to death to try to imagine an optimum future if you don't have courage. It'll feel totally overwhelming. Does that sound familiar? Think about it. When you think about what you might become, if you're a clinician, you notice that people will get overwhelmed if you lift up where they might actually get to. So in other words, if you're a therapist, you don't always tell the people you're working with what the possibilities where you see they might go. Because they may be at a place where if you were to share with them where they might get to, it may feel totally overwhelming and they may terminate. Especially if they're a dependent personality disorder. There are a lot of folks that have a lot of dependency issues. So even if you see a lot of possibility for a person, it's not necessarily a good idea to tell them. It's important for you to see it, though, if you're a helper, if you're a leader, if you're a helper. You gotta tell them when they've got enough courage to face it. Okay. Do you see the logic there? It takes a lot of courage to face what's wrong with you. It takes a lot more courage even to start imagining what you might become if you had the courage. It takes consistency in taking a stand against these things that are trying to kill you or you won't get there. And the key, this fourth element, and I haven't always understood this. This has been, I've been learning a lot more about this in recent years and months. It's caused me, as I said earlier today, to take a new look at the theories of energy, of libido, the different libido theories from Freud on through Jung and so on. That is to say, have you noticed how many people know what's wrong with them, or at least they've got a good sense of problems they've got to work on? They've got a vision of where they might like to go. But they don't do it. And week after week goes by, session after session of therapy, month after month, year after year, and they don't move very far. Sometimes or at all. So the courage is a big issue. However, it's only recently that I've realized if you are experiencing a kind of a psycho-spiritual brownout, and somebody, your therapist or you, said, come on, let's get going toward your individuation, Let's confront this demon or this dragon. Very interesting how often a person won't remember that during any of the time before the next analytical session. It's amazing. Next analytical session, you talked about it again. And something happens. They don't have any courage. So why? Why don't they have courage? Well, increasingly, it's become clear to me that if you think you're going to brown out now, if you're just running on empty, your fumes, in your gas tank, your energy gauge is saying empty, and then your therapist or your partner or whatever keeps saying, why are you so how wimpy you are? You don't do anything. The key is in the energy for a lot of people. If they are already feeling like they're browning out, they like energy grids. What happens in energy grids? If you're getting there toward a real meltdown of the whole system because the energy is low, you don't take on new plants. You don't take on new suburbs. In Chicago, you start shutting down areas. That's what's been happening in California. You don't think about taking on new challenges, no matter how important they are. If there's not enough energy, if there's not enough, that is, and I've got to make this little caveat here, if there's not enough usable energy, for those of you who've got a lot of the lover archetype in you, you got loads of energy, but it's not manifesting in forms that are usable. And so this is the way this goes. You've got to have energy available, psychic energy, libido. After the break, we'll talk about spiritual energy. This is all related to Kundalini. This is all related to grace. This is all related to all those spiritual traditions, energy theories. And once you begin to connect those dots, things begin to make a lot more sense. You got to have energy or you won't have courage. And if you don't have courage, you're not going to have knowledge. Somebody tell me why that is. If you don't have courage, you won't have adequate knowledge about what's wrong. Why?
As an action.
Yeah, all right. If there's something that's just getting ready to kill me, and I let myself know it, I'm not stupid. I know I'm going to have to fight it. And so you can understand the way denial works. If I don't have the energy that's accessible in an accessible form, I won't have courage. I won't have courage to take a stand for my best self. This is where Tillich and Jung go together. See, Jung always said, individuation is there. It's a human possibility. But he always said, most people will not individuate. Why? It's too hard. They give up. They give up. They give up on themselves. Very few places where Tillich and Jung are in such total agreement. They're in total agreement about this thing. Okay, so you got to have a certain amount of courage, or you won't even ask the right questions. It's a lot easier to think about what's wrong with all the people around you. And of course, beauty of that in terms of the seduction of it, you're usually right? You're not stupid. You know that there are really a lot of outer causes. Your partner's got these problems. Your organization's got those problems. Your boss has got these problems, and so on. And a lot of the time, those are less threatening things to see. It takes a lot less energy and a lot less courage to face other people's problems. It takes some. Denial, though, if you really lack energy and courage, you'll be in massive denial, and you'll be living in as Tillich called it, dreaming innocence, or as Jungians would say, unconscious, totally unconscious. Okay. So, and if you don't have energy to have courage, you will not face the challenge of thinking about what's possible for you. Really. And I put this, a vision of optimization for your selfhood. Optimization, that's my emphasis, because I think it's consistent with both Tillich and Jung. Optimization, not perfection. Optimization, what is realistically possible. Now, realistically, see, I don't mean that like a lot of people, that's why I put it in quotes. In terms of what is actually true about human existence, in other words. Go back to the first this morning. You're never going to completely actualize your essential selfhood in history. That's not what humans do. Humans are in touch with it intuitively, though, and it can be experienced as a regulating, inspirational vision, or it can be experienced as a crushing source of guilt and condemnation. Right? Does that make sense? But you're wired for it. But a realistic goal is something that would be attainable by humans. And in general, and in specific, somebody that has the particular realities of your destiny. In other words, a realistic goal is something that takes into account the destiny pole without giving it all the power to shut you down. Do you see what I mean there? That is to say, if you have a tremendously traumatic personal history, you have to take that into account. You don't want to make it the tail that wags the dog. But you have to take account of that when you're deciding what you're going to go into, what you're going to do. So if you're a person who is working very hard to increase your membranes between you and the world so you don't feel everybody's pain all the time, then you may want to think twice before you become a psychotherapist. You follow that? A lot of folks don't take stock about what it is to be a healer. If you choose a healer role, what that practically means, you're going to be in the presence of a lot of non-being a lot of the time. Not just yours. Do you follow me? So in other words, you take stock about what has been present in your destiny to get a realistic sense about, where would I be at my best self? What expressions would give me a chance best chance to be my best self? Okay. Now, I said that in terms of my theory, many of you know it, could teach it. The magician function is involved in the Diagnostics. in my theory, the royal function is involved in coming up with a vision for yourself. In other words, you have to ask the question, what selfhood am I going to build? It's a building project. And that takes a lot of courage. Because if you're going to build something, it takes a lot of pizzazz to move toward it. But you got to have a blueprint for it. Okay. So we've got these 4 fundamental elements. And now let me just complexify a little bit more in terms of talking about the things that make it real necessary for you to have courage, those things that are inner and outer that are trying to kill you. And we talked about the active presence of non-being. And so in terms of obstacles to transformation, now clearly, anticipating our last session this afternoon, clearly a big obstacle to transformation is not being plugged into the energy. And closely behind it is being plugged into the energy so much that it's like drinking from a fire hose. So that's one big area of obstacles. Another area of obstacle is not having an adequate assessment of where I am fragmenting ontologically or psychologically. Another obstacle, not putting enough energy into my visioning process. Spending enough time, laying aside enough energy to invest that energy in futuring. Big obstacle, because finally, if you don't know where you want to go, it's awful hard to get there. Okay. So you get those obstacles. And the lack of courage, doesn't matter what you know about where you want to go, doesn't matter knowing what's wrong. If you do not have that courage to really take a stand day to day, every day, a number of times during the day, the amazing thing is how close to the ground you have to fly on this courage thing. It's like, it's not enough to get up in the morning and affirm your courage. You've got to affirm it, at 9:32 a.m. And then you got to affirm it again at about 10:13. And it's like that. It's constant. And when you go to sleep, which is very easy to do, it's amazing. You just kind of go passive again. You just kind of go passive in the face of the things that are trying to kill you. And that's not a good strategy for healing, transformation. Okay. Now, in Jung's work, and in a lot of contemporary therapies, particularly depth psychologies, informed by the psychoanalytic tradition. I was going to start talking about the personal unconscious, but let me just emphasize this outer thing again first. This is very important for people who are psychologists and psychotherapists of all schools, any healers. If you don't look at the structural dimensions of chaos in society, then you won't really be understanding how many forces in this world are out to destroy the human that are not personal. That is, you've got to look at all of the forces of non-being on this planet today that are rapidly making it more and more difficult for human existence to thrive. And this is another thing. Psychoanalysts typically do not put enough energy into larger cultural dimensions of pathologizing, creating illness, toxicity for people. Margaret Shanahan and I are working on a new institute for psychoanalysis, culture, and spirituality, and we hope to bring the insights of the psychoanalytic traditions to bear, not just in terms of personal dysfunction, but to look at a lot of the structural, cultural things that are trying to destroy the human, and to use psychoanalysis to try to understand how all of those things influence the psyche. Let me just give you one concrete example. one of the things that is not studied enough of Tillich is his criticism of technology and the industrialization process. He's not a Luddite, somebody that wants to throw out technology and go back to the farm, so to speak. But he understands the forces. He calls them the forces of thingification. You've heard of treating people like commodities. There are enormous forces in the world today that are organized through massive power in the market systems of the world. And this is not, don't take this as an attack on capitalism. Don't reduce it to that. The socialists are not any better at avoiding thingification. In fact, some people can say they're a lot worse. But there are these massive forces to make people operate quietly, compliantly as cogs in machines. To make you think of yourself as less than a human being. And to think of yourself only as a consumer, only as somebody that doesn't rock the boat, only as somebody that does not point to any injustices. You know, there are enormous forces, and they're not personal, and you know they're equal opportunity forces. They are present in every community, and so in other words, just because you're paranoid, it doesn't mean that there's not somebody out to get you. Because there are a lot of things trying to destroy your environment and to make human beings not more conscious, less conscious. Madison Avenue advertising is a kind of a psycho-spiritual anesthesia, giving simple answers to incredibly complicated questions. If you know what I mean, I don't have to belabor that. Okay, so those are outer forces, and Tillich would point a lot to that. I think Jungians need to learn from Tillich that there are a lot more reasons for lack of centered selfhood than just, unwillingness to learn Jungian psychology. There are a lot of things that are trying to make us forget psychology altogether. In fact, I hate to tell you, but psychology is under attack today. The practice of psychology. There are huge economic forces that are trying to do away with psychotherapy and turn it all into neurophysiological medication. You follow me? I'm not making that up. That would fill up weeks of study. Many PhD dissertations could be done on that topic and not exhausted. So, but anyway, to the psychological task, this is very bad, because if you do away with depth psychology in general, or psychological reflection in particular, you do away with the very forces that are trying to get people conscious. And let's just start with the personal unconscious, because this would include all the dynamic therapies. That is, there are things in your personal unconscious that are trying to decenter your selfhood. In fact, they've already done it. Whether you call these things your lifestyle assumptions, as an Adlerian would call it, or your introjects, as an object relations theorist would call it, or your dysfunctional learnings, all sorts of different theories treated different ways. But there are residues in your personal unconscious. Jungians have a complex theory. You've got personal complexes that have a history. And those things are trying, remember the thing about self-identity, the challenge of self-identity that we talked about in Tillich? Complexes, to the extent that they are autonomous complexes and operating out of consciousness, those things are trying to decenter your selfhood. And of course, the more unconscious you are about them, the more practical forces of disintegration are present in your personality system. So you don't have to be a Jungian to understand that. That is widely understood and just talked about differently by many different psychological theories. And it's absolutely true. And Tillich studied this stuff. He was among the philosophers. He's probably the philosopher that studied psychology the most. And practical, existential aspects of psychology. And if you study his work, you'll see all this sophisticated understanding about how these personal aspects of forces of destruction in the personality operate. So there's that personal level. We Jungians, we talk about them as autonomous complexes. And classical Jungians, and I would say people that really practice more as Jungians per se and not as so-called archetypal psychologists. Archetypal psychologists, in my view, you've heard me say before, I don't really think they're Jungian in the theoretical sense of the word. But to the extent that they focus on any kind of complex organization, then they would fit in this category too. In my work, I attend to that sort of thing, and what I'm trying to do now in my work is to Jungians always have said that at the core of every personal complex there's an archetypal content. They've always taught all the analysts that. That's part of the Jungian dogma. At the core of your personal complexes there's an archetypal content. Then they don't bother to tell you any more about that during the training. And that's because that's hard to figure that out. What I've spent most of my work on in recent years is focusing on the archetypal dimension of the forces that are trying to kill you. That is, the non-personal, not the non-personal outer forces, but the non-personal inner forces that if you are not really conscious and if you're not taking a stand with courage for your best selfhood, these archetypes in your personality, they're not that friendly. They invade you. And if you study my work, you'll see that there, in fact, you can look at this brochure that we passed out. On the back, you've got my decoding of these archetypal territories. And if you study my lectures on psychopathology, the collective unconscious and psychopathology and the archetype compulsion and healing lectures, what I go into is the way in which different archetypes invade, try to colonize the person. And when you're not aware of what archetypes are the most imperialistic in your personality, you will often mistake an archetypal invasion for an expression of yourself. In my personal life, to give you an example, because of my family history and birth order and all that sort of thing, I was set up by my family system to take refuge in magician areas of the psyche, be smart. I was the one who was supposed to be smart. And it was okay for me to be smart. And I was reinforced for being smart. And so, in other words, the seduction of my spirit by the magician archetype, if you study my life and you study my family, it makes total sense. The only thing is that if you start trying to live in an archetype, you lose your human life. You go into your head. If you go into the magician, you go into your head, and you live up here over life. And you think everything can be solved by insights. Just knowing. You don't know it requires courage. Yeah, well, you have courage to think. But if you're possessed by an archetype, you don't have courage to think your way out of that archetype. You just think that's you. And it's not just true about, in my work, I try to show if you're possessed, if your life is being invaded by the lover archetype, you're going to have a lot of chaos in your life. There's not going to be a structure in your life. You're going to be, on the one hand, flooded with energy and then shut down into massive depression or addictive patterns. There's nothing wrong with the lover archetype, but when it invades you and you can't take a stand with courage against its invasion, it attacks your selfhood. It decenters you. It splits your personality. And so if you're a rageaholic person or a person that is acting out sadistically a lot with family members, really being cruel to family members. And I must say this is distributed between men and women, not just men that do this. There are a lot of abusing spouses verbally abusive as well, and physically abusive. And they are being invaded by the warrior archetype. And in their ego consciousness, they rationalize what they're doing. Well, you made me do it. You know, if only you hadn't said that, I wouldn't have hit you. See, the ego is always going to rationalize. That's an ego defense. And when you're invaded by these archetypal structures, the ego always tries to rationalize why it's doing that. This is why I chose that. I chose to beat you up because blah, 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 blah. And the ego really believes it. That's the scary part. And so what I've been trying to do in my work is to show the extent to which, in addition to these personal complexes, we have to look at those archetypal energies that are coming into the personality and forming a psycho-spiritual aneurysm, a ballooning of the boundaries of the self, the little s self, or the ego. We are being invaded by archetypal contents. We don't know it. And you know, if you got a dog, you know when you scratch a dog, that leg would just go. That's like the human ego. You know, the archetype comes in, invades the personality, and the ego starts going, I'm the one causing this. So if you're going to get awake enough consciously from a depth psychological point of view, and with any Jungian worthy of the name, they're going to work with you on your autonomous complexes. And they're going to try to help you understand the way that complex is trying to decenter you and put you off the individuation path. And in my work, I'm trying to show you how not all those things that are trying to kill you are personal. Some of them are archetypal. And the task of a human being is to become more human, not to become an archetype. And so what does it take in the struggle for transformation? You need to understand where you're being invaded. How much of it is because of your personal traumas in the past, in your family, so on, cultural problems in your particular group you grew up in, and how much of it is because of what some of those experiences did, either in your family, birth order, whatever, to open you to an archetypal invasion. And so look at the personal side, but also look at what is the impersonal, transpersonal archetypal content that is causing you to fragment. And what I try to show people is it's not all over the place. It's not an infinite variety of these things. And what I try to do is take Milan's work, Theodore Milan's work, and the DSM-4, and show how you can go through these diagnostic categories and you can see what the invasion, the transpersonal, the impersonal archetypal contents are that are characteristic of different disorders. So, so in terms of psychological sophistication and looking at obstacles to transformation, we need to be aware of the outer historical, cultural, social things that are trying to kill people so they don't get into a negative inflation and take total responsibility for all the things that have been trying to kill them, because there are a lot of impersonal things in the outer world that's trying to destroy their lives. We need to acknowledge that without doing what from this morning? We acknowledge the social forces that have been trying to destroy this person without doing what? Based on this morning, without encouraging what? Polar split. Yeah, without privileging the destiny too much. We have to be able to say to the person, yes, you're absolutely right. This has had a big influence on you. But now, our question today is, where is your wiggle room? Where is your freedom of action? Where are you free in ways you don't know you are? To take a stand for your selfhood. Does that make sense? Okay. So you deal with that outer dimension. It's important. Otherwise, you may lead a person to have too much guilt and condemnation. They may take responsibility that they don't have for a lot of the things that's happened to them. And that would not be healthy. And then you work at that personal complex level, look at that family system. look at the roots of those complexes and various traumatic experiences and so on. But again, therapists err on this kind of thing a lot. Say you were sexually abused as a child, terrible experience, or you were physically abused a lot, traumatized, terribly traumatized. There is a tendency for everybody, those who have been the victims of that and their therapists, there is a tendency for them to err, as we said this morning, putting too much emphasis on that destiny. Because it is very, very destructive to constantly put emphasis on the horrible results of this trauma and not put adequate emphasis on freedom to grow, freedom to heal, freedom to change, freedom to find the strengths, freedom to go on, freedom to ritualize. I do a lot of stuff with the ritual process and the importance of grief rituals. To find people that can adequately ritualize with you. This is getting ahead of myself here. This is spirituality. But find people that can act that can ritualize with you an acknowledgement in community of the traumas you've expressed, so that it's not repressed or denied, but then be able to ritually let that go. Die to that. That's the initiatory process. And then be able to step into a new phase. So, and then we've already talked about the archetypal. So let me open it up here for a few minutes, and then we'll discuss a little bit, and we'll take a break. These are the elements of transformative process. You can see how they're interlocking. And you can see that no matter what the outer forces are, the destructiveness, no matter what the inner forces are, you need awareness of these things, but you won't have that if you don't have the courage. You won't let yourself know. And you need to have a vision of where you can go. But if you don't have the courage, you won't put any energy into that. And why won't you? Because the chances are, the reason you don't have courage, for most people, not all, is that you don't have energy. And let me say this, I can eliminate the exceptions by saying you don't have connection to usable energy. Remember, those of you that have got a lot of lover energy, you got enough energy. If we could all just plug in to your lover energy, it would light us all up. But if you're structured with a lot of lover archetype influence, as compared to the other parts of your psyche, a lot of that energy, you won't be able to stand it. So you'll put it away. You'll dampen it down through a depression or an addiction, and it won't be usable. So if you have any questions about that, we'll engage about that. But the point of it is, the key is usable energy. If you have usable energy, you can have courage. In principle. You got to choose, though. You got to act. And if you're going to choose and you're going to act, you need to know where you want to go. Because if you don't know where you want to go, you're just going to sit there and race your motors. You won't know you won't put it in gear. So there we are. Let me open the floor now to engagement, and then we'll take a break. Yes, back here. Yes. 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 Yes.
You have the energy, give the face whatever issues there are. I mean, actually have courage in order to face that and have a vision. So develop the energy to develop spiritual practice.
Yeah. No, that's good. That's good. See, because you can be flooded with energy and not have a clue about spiritual practice, see. A lot of people are. And they just don't connect the dots because nobody's ever helped them to connect the dots. They don't know how lucky they are, for one thing. They don't know how lucky they are that all that energy is around. Because I know people that it's hard for them to feel sorry for manic people or real flamboyant lover types. even though manic people have a lot of problems and real flamboyant lover types, they kind of have a lot of chaos. Interesting chaos, but it's chaos, you know? And it's like they don't know how lucky they are to have all this energy. But it's good news and the bad news, you know? You know where the energy is. Nobody has to convince you that there's such a thing as libido. You know, I can talk to them and say, hey, you got lots of energy. Yeah, I got lots of energy. See, they know it. But they never thought about what that's got to do with spirituality. In fact, they may think it doesn't have anything to do with it. They may think they got that because they don't have any spirituality. But that's where we have to help people by, you know, having adequate theorization about this. And Tillich and Jung are almost on exactly the same place on this. It's like there are these primal generators. In Jung, it's the archetypal realm. The collective unconscious is loaded with energy. See, a lot of people talk about archetypes this, archetype that. But you know how you know whether something's an archetype or not? It's whether or not it's loaded with energy. If it's not loaded with energy, friends, it's not an archetype. There's not any wanderer archetype. You know? I mean, archetypes are loaded with energy, and they tend to do, you know, that thing where they used to put iron filings on a piece of paper and put the magnet up under it? When there's energy there, in an archetypal form, it'll organize those filings in a certain way. And so the deal is, what we got to get to after the break is, to start with the understanding that whether you call it libido and you just are talking psychology, and you got your psychology hat on, or you put your spirituality hat on and you talk about grace or kundalini or chi, phenomenologically we're talking about the same thing. This is energy. And the interesting thing about it is, it's either flowing around or it's not. And when you got somebody that's depressed, really depressed, they are not accessing it in any usable way. We can play with the question of what's really going on down there in the unconscious. My theory, that is, it is so powerful that they're having to completely shut down the circuit in order not to be psychotic. See? In other words, if you really feel like you have absolutely no energy, it's probably real strong in you. And you're just lucky you have real good ego defenses, we call it. Your ego defenses are keeping the thing turned down so it doesn't blow you up. I'm going to get into that a lot when I teach this thing on psychic energy, because you start to study this stuff comparatively, you begin to see. You know, Jung said that you have to have the numinous to heal. Well, what's numinosity? It's sacred energy, it's power. It's a manifestation of sacred power. Boom. It's not a theory. This is where people misread Tillich. They thought he was talking abstractly. He's not talking abstractly at all. He said, from his point of view, hey, power of being is something. And I get with you, and it doesn't take me long. I know whether you got a lot of it or not too much of it. Why? Because you glow if you've got a lot of it. Now, you may be like the flame that moths fly into. You know, there are people that I know that they are like the flame, and the moths fly into them all the time, get burned up, get their wings burned up, you know, crash. But this, see, what fascinates me about this is, look at this. Numinosity is related to charisma, which is related to celebrity. Get that? Why is celebrity such a big deal in our culture? Well, it's because we've got so stupid about how to connect with the energy in more constructive ways. So people treat celebrities as energy sources. And through an idealizing projection, they try to connect with it through that. So this whole thing about energy, we'll talk about it more after the break, but both Tillich and Jung understand there's no shortage of energy. The question is, like I'll say after the break, what is spirituality? Well, it's finding the connection with the energy, and it's whatever you do to keep the energy from destroying you and everybody else around you. So, you be thinking about that. How do you get connected to the energy? And what do you do to keep from being destructive to yourself and everybody around you? That's your spirituality. I don't care what you think it is. Spirituality is what is the truth about those two things. Are you connected to the energy? If so, I mean, if you're aware of, if it's in your ego consciousness, then great. Then we say, where do you connect with it? And the answer may not be what your pastor would like to think, or your priest. But that is your connection. That is your sacrament. We'll get into that after the break. Wherever you connect with the energy is your sacrament. See, this whole theory of Tillich's is a sacramental philosophy. He thinks the energy is everywhere. If you got eyes to see it. Yes, back here you had, I believe, Sammy, did you have your hand up?
I want to speak to you, high grace into what you just been saying in terms of connection is rebellion, is specifically of grace.
Yes, grace. Well, see, I come out of one of the Protestant tribes in my family of origin. And, Protestants got they really prided the intellect. They really privileged the intellect, the history of Protestantism. In other words, what we know as systematic theology today is really, has really been nurtured a lot by Protestantism. In other words, Protestants depreciate the ritual systems. The ritual systems of Catholicism and Anglo-Catholicism and all those things. Those used to operate on a very different understanding of what grace is. Grace in the Roman Catholic tradition was not a concept, was not a theological idea. It was a reality. Either you are infused with it or you're not. And so the whole theory of the Mass, Jung was very fascinated with this. Look at his stuff in fact, I wanted to lecture today on the transformation symbolism in the Mass. And I will address that some after the break. But the Mass is about energy flows. And it's not about an idea about energy flows. It's not the idea of the holy, the mistranslation of Rudolf Otto's title. It's not the idea of the holy, it is das Heilige, it is the holy. And so grace, in my view, rightly understood. I think that we Protestants are wrong about this. Wrong in what we've done with this. That is, grace is not an idea. It is energy. And the whole thing about the relationship between faith and works, it's related to this idea of can your ego provide the energy it needs for life? And the old Catholic tradition used to say, no. And Protestants agree with that. No, it cannot. So there are a lot of these arguments, but Protestants have so shifted this thing, the way they interpret, the way we got beyond, we think we got beyond symbolism and ritual and myth and all that sort of thing, and turned everything into kind of theory. And the real key is that grace is charisma. It is energy, usable energy. And the reason people gravitate toward folks with charisma, they know they need the energy. So they go wherever it's flowing. Other comments or questions before we take a break? Yes.
Have the energy or the charisma, but we think that what they have is really.
What was the first word to these? What? Oh, yes. Many of them actually have energy. Oh, it's that too. Yeah, let me comment on the dynamics of this. She's asking, well, now do these celebrities really have energy, or are they just feeding on our idealizations? Yeah, right. No, that's absolutely right. Well, see, this is the whole dynamics of which is fascinating to me. The dynamics of idealization in the way it works in human beings. Because if you're not connected enough to your own wonderfulness, you will experience your gold out there in other people, in idealizing projections. And say you are a rock star, and you're not just ordinary, you're really good. And so you're not idealizing other people. And you really get into where you think, you're the high priest of rock and roll, or the high priestess of rock and roll, which is most of them that are successful. They really think they really identify with that. Now, it's bad enough if you're a rock star to deal with your own golden energies. Call that grandiose exhibitionistic libido. That's the technical $250 word for that. That's what makes you successful, because you don't have any problem in standing up here and manifesting. And that's what people love about you, because they can't do it. They can't stand up and manifest. But you're a rock star, you can get out there and you're just as exhibitionistic as hell. You just love it. You can just let it all hang out, literally. I don't know whether you've seen some of those music videos. But then her point comes to the fair. See, I may be a sort of organized narcissistically in such a way that I can kind of keep from being crazy with that right at that point. But all this adulation coming from those that can't stand in their power. So I'm dealing not only with my grandiosity, I'm dealing with all my audience's grandiosity, which they can't deal with by themselves. They can't relate to their energy by themselves. They need me. So they load theirs onto me. That's another thing. In my Facing the Dragon book, I talk about this a lot. This is what happens. Most human beings, and see, this is where the individuation process is very important. Because unless you're claiming your gold, this afternoon we can say your divinity, unless you're claiming that piece of divinity, that little territory of divinity that you've been assigned to you, unless you are working with that and trying to make peace with that in a dynamic, creative way, you will unload that somewhere. You will, in fact, displace that. You won't be able to stand having it in here. It's a typical pattern. In fact, if you have an inferiority complex, you're doing it. You're unloading your own golden flower self onto something or someone else. You got to ask, what is it? Where's it going? Because that's soul loss. That's shamanic soul loss. And that's not even the worst of it. That's bad. But what is even worse is what happens when people do that. Because what we do is we unload our grandiosity. I'm humble. It's just my religious group that's perfect and true and right and the only one. So we unload our grandiosity onto our religious group. We unload our grandiosity onto our race. We unload our grandiosity onto our nation. We unload our grandiosity onto our social class. Any place we can put it, we put it there because we can't stand how wonderful we really are. And the tragedy of that is just beyond words. Because what it does, it destroys the individual's chance for what we've been talking about. But it's worse than that. It creates Nazism. It creates the Inquisition. It creates global genocidal racism. Creates consumerism that destroys the planet. That is, the lack of attention to these spiritual development agendas create enormous evil. And so it's not just, in other words, this is classic Jung. If you don't face your individuation task, you're making the world a lot more evil place. And if you understand these dynamics, you can see that's not just Jung's fuzzy idea. There are actual clear dynamics that we can explain that cause that. Let me take one more question, and then let's stretch our legs, and then come back and we'll work on spirituality some more, because it's all related. Yeah.
Brief comment on a sort of question.
Okay.
Your courage is flying close to the ground. I think that's It sounds like for Tillich, this is the comment I'm sort of learning. It sounds like for Tillich, courage has an opposite in grace. Maybe you're going that way. In the final analysis, courage can't stand on its own. It requires something else. But that's not my question.
Yes.
It easily gets seduced by big ideas. My question is this. You made the comment, which I think resonates with lots of folks. Courage flies close to the ground.
Yes.
Is there good descriptions, insights in the clinical literature on encouragement from a Tillich point of view? Encouragement.
Yeah. Not as much as there should be. I tell you, the people that are the best at that are the Adlerians, because they always understood that psychopathology comes from discouragement. That's their whole rap. If you're messing up, if you're really messing up, it's because you are discouraged, and instead of facing your real life task of love, work, friendship, and a viable philosophy of life to live by, instead of facing the task of developing those life tasks, you don't have the courage you need to face them, so you go into sideshows. And you put all your energy into things that seem important, but they're not the real issue for you. And so the Adlerians have done a lot over the years on the encouragement techniques. And it's related to the whole idea of mentoring. It's related to what I talk about in my work is the royal agendas, the royal capacities. If you have a royal capacity in your psyche that's available, you will be able to effectively to mentor people and encourage them. You'll be able to bless them, in effect. Being encouraged is usually a result of being blessed by someone that you deem important. Blessing is blessing is always really at low altitude too. It's always very concrete. It's very specific, and it sees the person in their individuality. Like, for example, in your world, a manager who isn't good at that is really harming the company, because the people that work for a manager, when that manager looks at them, does not see them concretely, individually, and see their potential, and if that person is not able to make concrete comments which affirm and challenge in a creative way, then that person is not being as productive as they could be. There's enormous and growing evidence about this kind of thing, and that motivation is very hard to do. You can't just bring in a cheerleader, no matter how good the motivational speaker is, because it's too impersonal. Effective leadership is always very, very personal in certain ways. So anyway, let me go back to that first question, though, the first part of it. The relationship between courage and grace is not a polarity. It's more like the last thing you said. If you don't have connection with energy, you will not have the courage. You can have energy without courage. You get that? You can have lots of energy without courage, because courage requires you to know what all that energy is for. And you've got to make a decision to take a stand. And so you can just be loaded. There are some really creative people that are loaded with energy, but they don't really have courage. And you can see this because so many creative people are self-destructive. That's just a fact. And what I'm just trying to help you understand today is why creative people are self-destructive. Because creative people are just awash in energy. And because of something about their particular structure and their personality, they are not like those of us that are not creative. They manage somehow to plug into enough of that and connect it to the turbines to get something done. Creative people get things done. But they're very good at rocking and rolling, but they are real bad at regulating. And that's why the ones that can't regulate don't last very long. Elvis, rock and roll, no regulation. And who's that guitar player for the Stones? Keith Richards. Now, you may laugh at me, but I say, the proof's in the pudding. Keith Richards is still alive. And while he was flying awfully close in proximity to the flame, he is not dead. And that is the way you know. Let's put it this way. If he had been my analysand, he might not have been as famous, see. But I would have tried to help him regulate a little more optimally. But you see, it depends on your theory, see. Does optimum regulation destroy creativity? I don't think so. I think that it makes you able to be creative more effectively longer. But optimizing your regulation, that is the spiritual challenge. And if you don't like spirituality, that's your psychodynamic challenge. Any other questions or comments before we take a break? A lot of stuff on the table here. Yes?
Well, I think to you that Cardinal Marley said he was a crony. When someone told him that recently that only as you watching this family when somebody was really psychotic or whatever, you know, pretty bad. And in that way, maybe you're going to be a big key on energy, but you really wasn't trained psychologically.
Right. Right. Yes, they're functioning under the same archetype. She's asking for the tape. She's talking about the fact that in the old days, the clergy would come in the face of mental illness, and though they didn't have any dynamic understanding, at least shamanic people, shamans had more dynamic understanding. More recently, clergy have not had that. But you see, archetypal stuff works whether you understand it or not a lot of the time. And this is, for example, if you come from a Roman Catholic tradition and you're not just militantly hating the Catholic Church, if you're struggling with any form of chaos in your life, if you go to Mass a lot, it will make you saner. Period. The priest doesn't have to understand a thing about that. All the priest has to do is be the mediator of archetypal symbolism in the Mass. And to the extent that you can access it, Jung talked about this, to the extent that you can access it, it will help you get centered. It will help contain your huge energies until you can, get more conscious. But what I like to point out is that healers operate under the magician archetype, the magus, the archetype of the magus. I've got another little manuscript. It's a monograph, an old monograph that should have been published 10 years ago. It's going to be The Magician and the Analyst, the archetype of the magus and the occult spirituality and Jungian analysis. And what I do in that is to articulate the way in which all healers, whether they're, prophets, priests, clowns, so forth, shamans, they all operate under that archetype of the magician. The question is, how mature are they? If they are very immature, they're voyeuristic and they are not very invested in the healing of the person. If they're very mature, in what I like to call a shamanic maturity, then they're very invested in healing and they will fight for the person's healing. Let's take a stretch now and a break. Let's come back at no later than 3:15, and we'll focus on the more the spiritual dynamics of this.
Discover your true masculine power through the king, warrior, magician, and lover archetypes, energies that have defined strong men for millennia. In just 5 minutes, this free test reveals which of your masculine energies are in balance and which need work. The result? Clear direction for your personal development and masculine empowerment. Thousands of men have gained insights to reshape their lives. Why not you? Take the Masculine Energy Indicator test now at masculinetest.com.